Dr. Jacob Torres, you are a researcher at UCSB.
Mm-hmm.
You were just telling me this crazy study with chicken McNuggets. I'm going to let you just jump right into that one real quick.
Oh yeah. So the study was they gave participants chicken McNuggets. That's the study, and they were going to look at kidney function. And they found that immediately after feeding chicken McNuggets to people, they saw a decrease in kidney function that persisted for, I believe it was 2 weeks after the feeding. So it's kind of this like, yeah, it doesn't sound like a good thing to do to people.
Is it? I mean, it's probably just because of the case that it's fried. I mean, I
think that was the main thing they were researching, was the effect of the fried component. Yeah,
the oxidized oils.
Yeah, and I mean the whole thing is going to be oxidized. Yeah, all of the proteins and whatnot, even inside, are probably oxidized.
How does that affect kidneys?
So there's a group of compounds called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, and these are compounds that occur when carbohydrates get fixed to proteins. So like these proteins become kind of like changes their structure essentially by fixing these carbohydrates to it. And there are receptors in the kidney or all over our body. It's called the RAGE receptor,
Mm-hmm.
the receptor of AGEs. So it's a great thing to say because they have this RAGE receptor, and that causes inflammation on itself. So if it detects these compounds, and it triggers inflammation. So one of the effects of that is actually alters the fluid balance. So the sodium uptake gets changed. So, people get really kind of puffy after they eat like fried foods. It's partially because this is the reason why. It's not the salt, it's not like the excess salt. It's that the kidneys are actually, the function of the kidneys changing to pull up more fluid because the function's gone down.
Hey, after today's video, I put a link for 30% off your entire order through Thrive Market. So Thrive Market's an online membership-based grocery store. So no matter what it is that you're trying to find and you want just like a better for you option than what you would find at a typical grocery store, you can find it with Thrive Market. So you can sort by low carb, you can sort by sugar-free, you can sort by baking, and you can trust that they're gonna have foods that don't have preservatives, don't have the nastiness in them. They do a lot of research before they put a product on their shelves, so to speak. So that link down below, 30% off your entire grocery order. And then you also get a free $60 gift with any purchase. So 30% off and a $60 gift. So use that link down below in the top line of the description. You'll see it there, and that's gonna get you those savings. So check them out after this video.
Interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's not, I mean, there is an impact if you have a ton of sodium. You definitely retain some water too.
It's the same phenomena, similar phenomena.
But you're basically reducing how much sodium is required to cause that issue when you're activating the RAGE receptor, essentially.
Yeah. So the kidneys has fluid balance, right? It pulls water in or releases water, and when it's inflamed, the balance of sodium uptake is altered with water, and so it pulls more water in, or it holds on to more water.
Dang, that's really wild.
Yeah.
And so if you look at, we'll come back to advanced glycation end products because I would definitely want to talk more about that and just kind of that world. But obviously your area of research is the kidneys. And one of the questions that I have, and we touched on a little bit in another interview when we were talking, but the effect of oxalates and free oxalate foods or high free oxalate foods. I mean, are oxalates really a problem, or is that just something that certain communities are shouting from the rooftops?
It's a problem. It's a very old problem. As long as there's been kidneys and I think organisms that consume carbon, there's been oxalate, and organisms have to deal with oxalate for that long. So it's definitely a problem. Yeah, for sure.
How exactly is it a problem? What happens when we consume? Okay, let's just say, for example, well, first off, what are some examples of high free oxalate foods?
I think the classic is spinach, rhubarb. Those are kind of like the big things. Anytime you eat something and you feel like grittiness on the teeth, that's the oxalate binding to the calcium that's just like in your mouth, so you can kind of feel like that kind of adherence.
Dang, I like the grittiness.
You like the grittiness? That's my favorite part of spinach.
So is that literally what you're feeling? Is the oxalic acid there?
Yeah, it's like binding to stuff on your teeth. Yeah.
Holy crap.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is that? What happens when that is ingested?
So if there's nothing bound to it and you just have free oxalate, then it'll get absorbed into the bloodstream and then it has to be filtered by the kidneys. I mean, oxalate will make its way into all the tissues. So if there's any other place that it's in high concentration, it can cause crystals. So if there's calcium or magnesium, it can cause crystals anywhere if the concentration is high enough. People get a lot of them in their thyroid. They get these crystals that form over their life. So it's known to have crystals in other locations besides the kidney. But once it's in the kidney, if conditions are right, so if you have the pH is low enough and the calcium or magnesium concentration is high enough, you'll form these microcrystals, and those can then turn into kidney stones if they're left unchecked.
And what happens? What happens when these oxalates or these crystals just form in random areas? Like if they form in your joints, like is this actually become an encumbrance to movement, or is it just something like that's just where they form? They never really form to anything that's like, can it actually, I know you're not a joint doctor, but I mean, is it going to actually make your joints less functional? I mean, they actually build up in high amounts?
Yeah, they're going to cause an inflammatory response. So I think that's the main issue, is that you would get, crystals are, like I said, that this is an old evolutionary question, like how do you deal with these crystals? So you have immune cells that their job is to try to go and deal with these crystals. And if they can't deal with them, then they'll, wall them up, cause some sort of scarring or fibrosis if they can't deal with it. But if they'll try to go to that site. So you might have some other white blood cells that end up in that area that cause inflammation.
And then there's a sort of a reactive oxygen species, sort of oxidative damage effect as well too. Does that happen? You mentioned something before about how that happens at the kidney level. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, the crystals itself cause a activation of a protein called NADPH oxidase, and that causes the release of free radicals, and then that causes inflammation on itself. So that's probably part of the signaling to help with like recruit cells nearby to know that there's crystals, and so that free radical damage itself is injurious, but it's also part of the signaling that tells the cells nearby that this is happening.
So localized effect and potential systemic effect, is that right?
Yeah, so that would be local at that event. So if you have the activation of a crystal on a particular cell that causes the reactive oxygen species release, that's going to signal the local cells to turn on the inflammatory response. They will then activate pathways that then secrete the cytokines that then can go to other nearby cells, and then that kind of propagates to find immune cells to come and tell them to deal with this problem.
Man, I mean, in your research, I don't know if you've seen, like, how long after ingestion does this cycle or cascade kind of happen? Is it hours, minutes,
hours?
Days?
Yeah, within hours. Yeah. So so my paper from 2019, where I looked at oxalate crystals in rats. So it was injecting oxalate. So we do IP injections, and within several hours, we could see massive crystals in the kidneys already.
Yeah, and then subsequent increases in inflammation and whatnot.
Oh yeah, so it has the main thing I was looking at in my paper was the kind of the progression of the ability to clear out those crystals, because you have this like tubule widening that occurs, and we were kind of, that's what I was studying specifically, was that this, how do the kidneys deal with these crystals normally? And so they kind of clog up the tubule, and then the tubules dilate, and then they clear out the crystals, and then they go back to their normal shape. So that's kind of like a progression over a week that occurs, but it happens very rapidly that they're all there. So if the concentration is sufficient, they'll crystallize quickly.
Now, if someone were to be listening to you for the first time, they say, okay, well, this guy's probably carnivore. He doesn't eat vegetables because vegetables have oxalates. But I asked you that question offline, and you said you do eat vegetables.
Yeah.
I mean, what, in terms of oxalates, like what do you have instead of spinach if you're trying to reduce that? Like, what kind of vegetables do you consume?
So I like arugula. That's like kind of like one of my go-tos. Cruciferous vegetables. So I like kale. I think the dino kale is supposed to be lower in oxalate than the curly kale. And I have no way to verify that, but that's what I've heard. And then I like Brussels sprouts and broccoli. Even though broccoli is on the higher side, I think it's just as long as you're avoiding overall getting too many your oxalate load for like a day, as long as you're not surpassing that, then you're probably going to be okay. Like, we have to deal with oxalate. Like, there's no way around it. Even normal metabolism, you produce oxalate. Like, there's no way to stop it. It's just how much are you getting exposed to in any one day.
Yeah, I think we have this misconception that we, on both sides, where we need to avoid oxalates. I mean, that's like trying to avoid pollution. Like, it's just not going to happen. Like, It's just everywhere. But then you have the other side that's, okay, like, yeah, maybe like we are consuming too much. You can consume too much in the way of spinach. I mean, why would you want to accelerate something? If we're dealing with it, we know it's problematic. Trying to get rid of it entirely is a moot point. That's just not going to happen. But there are clearly things that you could reduce consumption of that would slow that sort of acceleration. But you mentioned something before that was really interesting. So it's almost as though we've evolved to deal with oxalate, even down to a microbiome level, but things have sort of changed. I mean, what's different today? Like, why would you say we're probably less efficient at dealing with oxalate today than we would have been maybe 100 years ago?
I would think so, yeah. I think that so there's a bacterium that is, it's Oxalobacter frumenginens is the one that I'm thinking of right now. That's, a primary consumer of oxalate. And most people do not have that bacteria. Like, it's just missing from their microbiome. If you have it, then it's going to eat up a lot of the oxalate, and you don't have to worry about having too much of it absorbed.
Until you go on a round of antibiotics.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. And everybody's been kind of, on antibiotics, or the soil is just polluted and there's no way to get these bacteria back because they've been killed in some way. So there are, I think, research efforts to try to turn these into tools like that you could repopulate, maybe probiotic type stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that people are trying to do that.
Also to synthetically make a bacteria or something.
Or just find the one that exists in nature and turn it into encapsulated form. I think that's a research effort.
It's really interesting. I mean, when you look at the world of probiotic research, a lot of people think, I've looked at this a lot, a lot of people would think that probiotic research is just the same strains. There's a lot of really, really interesting research coming out in the world of not just the microbiome, but actually in how we can, because the literature on exogenously adding probiotics in is pretty strong. Where I'm curious is, okay, if oxalates are one of these things that we're just consistently consuming, what's the difference between those and another, say, anti-nutrient? I always had this thought process that maybe you develop a little bit of a hormetic effect. You kind of almost get stronger and more resilient at dealing with them. Is that not the case? It's almost like there's no way to deal with them. They just build up.
I think that the problem with oxalate is that we have no way of breaking it down. Like, there's no mechanism for the breakdown of oxalate. So once it's there, you kind of have to figure out how to get rid of, shuttle it out. And I think that's the issue with it. So other hormetic stresses, they might be toxic, but they're breakdownable. By, you might have a way of doing some sort of second pass metabolism, and they get either pooped out or something. But oxalate's trickier. You got to figure out how to get it through the kidney without causing an injury. Yeah, I think that's a tricky part.
What are some ways? I mean, are there some ways that you can, foods that you can combine or supplements that you can combine with higher oxalate foods? Let's say you're, going to grandma's house for dinner and she made something with spinach, and you don't want to be a total jerk. And you want to, you're like, okay, I don't want to have this. Hopefully people aren't going to be that crazy about it, but is there something that you can kind of consume alongside it?
Yeah, calcium-rich foods are good if you're going to have oxalate and putting calcium with it. I think you look at Indian food, they have a spinach dish, but it's got cream in it. So they've already naturally figured out a way to eat a lot of spinach without having. I don't know if they did it on purpose, but it works out the same way.
Do Indian people have good kidney health?
I don't know. I don't. They have a lot of diabetes, and India is very high in diabetes, but for other reasons, I think, besides the paneer they're eating.
That's true. I do know that the Indians have some of the best colon health, though.
Oh yeah,
probably from spices and stuff. Some of the best, and the fastest. This random fact: that's some of the fastest motility. Probably all the spicy food and.
They have high gut motility. Interesting.
Yeah, so it's that, and it was. Well, some regions of Africa, but what's interesting is with Africa, they didn't necessarily isolate for foodborne illness and stuff as well, which would definitely increase transit time or decrease transit time. So anyway, that's
I'm fascinated by that topic as well.
Yeah, but so consuming calcium. And then you mentioned before, we talked on another video about citrate.
Yeah, so we have a Santa Barbara Nutrients, the company we founded specifically for polycystic kidney disease, for kidney health, that we have a product that has calcium in it for that very reason, to hopefully bind excess oxalate so it doesn't get absorbed. So we have a citrate and BHB with calcium, magnesium, and potassium, and the calcium in there, specifically designed to bind up, hopefully oxalates and phosphates and whatnot.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I'll put a link down for that below. It's a pretty cool product. So. I want to pivot over to AGEs for a second. And again, I know it's not something you've done in your lab specifically, but you're very well spoken on it and make a lot of sense with it. Is there a relationship at all between kidney health and advanced glycation end products? And what are advanced glycation end products, just so people have a solid understanding? Because I think people think that I know people think, because I see it on Instagram all the time, that if they eat a sweet potato with some ground beef, that it's automatically glycated and it's going to be a problem. And I know that's not necessarily the case. Like, how does it all work?
Yeah, so there's a few things. So advanced glycation end products are the addition of carbohydrate onto proteins. And there's a few different ways that this can happen. So you have like an non-enzymatic version of that. So that's the one that I think is the primary concern, where you actually have just abundant glucose, and this is, I'm talking about in the blood in particular. So if you have very high glucose over long periods of time, that will just by virtue of the abundance of glucose, will cause its addition to proteins. And then that changes the protein structure, because proteins are designed to have many different sugar molecules on them. So I think it's hard to conceptualize if you don't know about this, but every cell has this thing called the glycocalyx. And the cell is just this, it has all these proteins protruding out of it. And then you have on each one of those proteins, you have all these branched sugar molecules all over it. And those are very important. The orientation of them, like how they are, like how they're linked, which sugars are on there. They tell a message to cells in the body about, like, this is me. Do not kill this cell. This is me. Or this is a docking site for a particular protein to bind to. So that orientation of those is very important in the glycocalyx. When blood glucose levels go very high, you can start to add glucose molecules onto those branching chains or onto the proteins themselves. And so now the code has been disrupted. So now a cell might see that and say, hey, this is no longer self, and then it causes an autoimmune disease. Or another protein can no longer identify its docking location, and so it can't bind to the cell appropriately. Or it might cause other things to bind to it inappropriately. So it changes the signaling just on itself. So that's a big part of it. And then you have the glycation of proteins themselves within the body, and that can then cause an activation of a receptor that identifies these proteins, that triggers inflammation on itself. And that's the RAGE receptor, the receptor for AGE.
Does that ever happen like acutely? Like, is there a situation where you consume, let's just go extreme scales, a pixie stick and whey protein powder or something, like two very fast absorbing, like you get these. Does it ever happen that fast, or is this much more like
That's a good question. I would imagine that, the rate is probably much slower, because since it's non-enzymatic, it requires the functionalization of a glucose or its target. Mm-hmm. It's like organic chemistry question. Like, it's just the amounts that are there is just, there's like a random amount that will go through that process. So if it's the time interaction is a big part of it. So how long they interact will determine also not just the concentration. Concentration does a lot. So if you had them like sitting in a glass and they were there for a long time together, you might be able to cause a non-enzymatic reaction to occur. But during your blood glucose spikes up and then it goes back down, like, is that long enough to cause that effect? Unlikely, I would think. Yeah.
I also wonder about someone that's like, Tour de France athlete that's like keeping their glucose high while they're riding for hours and hours and hours. It's like, okay, maybe that might be good for performance, but possibly still
could be deleterious. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, or at least, it's kind of funny because when you look at a lot of, and this is purely hypothetical, but you look at a lot of endurance athletes, and a lot of them, that are fueling, like, they age very fast, right? Like you see, we've talked about this in videos. Like you see that guy I've been running my whole life. He's 60 years old. He looks like he's 80. And it's like there's obviously this effect of like oxidative damage. But then I think about that too. Like with athletes, like, okay, even if you are independent of AMPK phosphorylation, it seems like there is probably not a good position to be in where you're keeping your glucose levels high all the time, even if it's for performance. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, I think not. I think there's probably some arterial stiffening that occurs from that as well. So that's probably some of the stuff you're talking about, like the they seem like they're aging, or they sometimes have heart attacks and whatnot. It's not just the stress. It's probably, some other metabolic stuff that's going on from having high glucose all the time.
Do AGEs, or are there RAGE receptors sort of in our vasculature as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're everywhere.
Yeah, so this is something that impacts, literally everything.
Yeah.
What about crossing the blood-brain barrier? Any evidence there?
I guess it would depend on the size of the protein, right? That just depends on which one it is there. I imagine that because there's a cutoff limit to like what can get across. Yeah. So I don't know. That's a good question.
So this kind of comes a full circle moment back to the chicken nuggets, right? So it's like, you think based on that study with kidney function, do you think it had more to do with the pure oxidation of the oils, or do you think there was this AGE effect, or was it both?
It's both, yeah. The oxidized lipids and the advanced glycation end products both have effects on kidney function. Yeah. So
in terms of, and they're both kind of working in that same avenue? Is it, so we talked a little bit about how like the oxidation could impact that, and then and I knew you touched on it briefly, but in the same way that sort of we've heard advanced glycation end products can affect liver metabolism and potentially fatty liver, same kind of concept there with the kidneys?
Yeah, I think that's the same concept. Anytime you have these inflammatory compounds, they just trigger with the same cascades. It's always like the same players, like the free radicals, NLRP3, all that stuff gets turned on in response to these pathways. So it's just like you kind of just pick your poison, and it kind of usually does the same thing. And so the AGEs and these oxidized lipids are both going to trigger the similar events.
Do you think that more of the problem when we look at seed oils and people kind of having a heyday on that, do you think it comes down much more to the oxidation, or what's kind of your take there? Again, not your realm of expertise per se.
Well, I have an opinion.
Yeah.
I have an opinion on a lot of things. Maybe I shouldn't have. But I think that oxidation is probably the bigger effect there. So if the reason avoiding seed oils is people can mention all sorts of different reasons. I would just say like probably the oxidation is the biggest player, because any oxidized lipids is bad. Like if you have olive oil just sitting out for too long and it goes rancid, or butter, like all these things, doesn't matter what it is, it's not good. Like it's bad for your cells, because these can get incorporated into membranes, and once they're in the membranes, they cause damage to the membranes, and then that injures the cell, and then you have to kill that cell. So it's just, the oxidation is likely the most damaging culprit, and then you can go into like the ratios, like you're getting too much omega-6, you're going down this pro-inflammatory pathway preferentially or whatnot, and I think that's probably secondary to the oxidized story.
Yeah, like a lot of the literature is suggesting that as far as the prostaglandins and the omega-6, omega-3, that's much less of an important point. I think we're finding that like as far as you're all ending up down the arachidonic acid kind of pathway anyway, and ultimately ending up at a lot of the same place in a lot of cases.
Exactly.
And it's like you take someone that's eating a bunch of omega-6s, but if it's good, legitimate, fresh omega-6, which I don't know if anyone even gets that, right? Like, but if someone was like picking nuts off of a tree and roast, again, it kind of begs the question of who is actually getting that. So then it kind of comes full circle. It's like, well, are you getting any seed oils that are actually fresh? And it's like we can demonize seed oils till we're blue in the face, but the reality is like no one is like squeezing sunflower seeds in their garage and consuming them immediately, right? But it's the question of the inflammation piece of omega-3s versus omega-6 is much less of the situation these days versus the oxidation.
Yeah, and the main sources of omega-6s are going to be from deep fryers. Yeah, that's like the main place everybody's getting their exposure, and then if you're getting it from they usually say like you buy foods in the grocery store. I don't know how much of those are actually the industrial versions of things. Either they're probably nowadays. I think a lot of products they say like expeller pressed and whatnot. So those probably don't have the same oxidation level as if you're eating it from a deep fryer. So it's hard to like talk about like what the effects are, because you got to know like the sources, like how did they actually test these things, and so I think there's a lot of stuff that needs to be figured out.
In terms of tips for avoiding sort of advanced glycation in products, that sort of world, do you have any tips for people, or is it really a matter of just bringing your glucose down?
Avoiding them is the least fun part, because that's like barbecues and frying food and whatnot. It does seem like if you add vinegar to things, it does prevent a lot of the glycation from occurring. So like it also cooking things like slow fryers and stuff increases, if it's low and slow is the good one. It's the high and dry that's always how I remember it. Like high and dry is going to cause more of these things to occur, and the low and slow is
so air fryers might be out.
I know, the air fryer is so yummy. I think if you put some vinegar on there, maybe you can try to mitigate.
Some balsamic, like balsamic chicken in the air fryer.
Yeah.
So you got some balsamic vinegar with it or something.
And try not to put the heat so high as to cause it. But yeah, the air fryer would be a source of these things. It's just everything. That's what I'm saying. Like everything is like it's ruined. But again, if you think about these things in more of like a holistic or a bigger picture thing, it's all about like punctuated equilibrium or punctuated stress, right? So if you're eating these things day after day after day, that's going to be probably a bigger problem than if it's like this is like once a week or or so often I'm eating this food that I cook in a less ideal way. But then as long as you've got all the other things on point, you're probably going to not be a big deal. It's probably be more like a hermetic stress.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And the thing, if high and dry is a problem, so from what you've seen, is high and dry worse than high and oily?
So that's the question, right?
I mean, like if you're going to deep fry something, even in like avocado oil, is that you're like, okay, I'm using a healthy fat. We can still oxidize even in a,
still oxidize that.
Still, is that, I guess you have a different element, then you're like stacking problems, right? It's like if you were to air fry, let's even say a healthy chicken nugget, say a chicken nugget that you breaded with something like some almond flour or something like that, and you air fried it, which is something that I've done. Okay, then you've got maybe a little bit of fat, but mainly pretty lean, and you're eating it at a high temperature compared to like frying that same healthy chicken nugget in a bunch of avocado oil. It's like on one hand, high and dry, you're getting more potential AGE, but in the oil, you're getting some AGE plus oxidized oil.
Right, exactly.
So it's pick your poison, really.
Exactly. I know. Like food preparation is just it's all can of worms, right? What do you boil everything? I mean, that's like that's what it comes down to, is like boil and steam all your food.
Yeah.
So it's like, how much life are you willing to trade for living?
Yeah. No, it's a good point, man. I think that, the dose makes the poison at the end of the day. And then just bringing it back to kidneys for just a second, if this has an effect on the kidneys, how long do you typically see improvement afterwards? And at what point does it become like irreversible, where it's actually causing real problem to the kidney?
Are you saying improvement from
just the consumption, like back to the chicken nugget kind of thing? Okay. So I think you said it was a couple of weeks or something,
I think that
right?
was a couple of weeks of decreased function that they observed, yeah.
And then eventually, any literature within that same study, like with chronic consumption, does it just become like a spiral downwards? Or
I would think so, yeah. I think that once the inflammation is meant to be acute. Once it becomes chronic, there's just like that pathway. The pathway for inflammation is meant to be like on, resolve the issue, and then go back to the normal state. When it's on, you just kind of end up with a lot of weird stuff that happens because cells they're kind of like in this preparatory state, like they're like wanting to do something, and they're kind of like, what's going to happen? And so at that preparatory state, all these other maintenance things turn off. So like the normal state of like clearing out damaged organelles and mitochondria, like that gets turned off while you're in this preparatory state, because that's all like repair, rest function. And in the inflammatory state, you have to be ready to like divide or to make, you don't want to be like doing something when there's an injury around, because, you're going to mess something up. That's like these very delicate processes like cell division. And so when things do go awry in that state, it's because they've like accumulated damage. Yeah. And that's where you get like cancer cells. That's kind of like the pathology of cancer.
So, I mean, people very much so can feel an acute impact of food then. I mean, it's just because sometimes people look at me like I'm crazy when I say, hey, well, if I eat that, sometimes I'll say I feel inflamed. I don't know if that's the right word, but like something is off. Clearly, like I feel stiff, I feel achy, my workout performance is in the toilet. It's like, okay, clearly like that dietary choice made an impact over here. So it's almost though you can feel the effects of chronic inflammation in a short-term phase. And then there's people that have that turned on all the time. And then people that are like a little healthier and they feel those changes, right? I've always kind of likened it to that. I'm a pretty healthy person. So the delta between like when I have something that actually makes me feel inflamed, I feel it versus maybe someone that's just, they're on all the time.
Exactly.
Maybe they don't feel it.
Exactly. Yeah. You described a very good phenomenon. So I had mentioned before that, we're in this, cells are homeostatic regulators. So they, whatever that mean is your state. And when you go up or down below that, you feel it. If you're in a good sensitization state, if you're in a highly inflamed state, that regulator is moved up. So now that's your baseline. So you might not going to feel additional inflammation. You might feel when it goes down because that's a big difference in the delta. But if you just keep going up above that, it's not a big change. So there's no sensation. So I think that's what you're describing is that homeostatic regulation has changed. So when you're healthy, it's like you can sense when something's wrong because this is not normal. Like there's some acute change that's happened.
So to get off the roller coaster, just feel like shit all the time.
Yeah.
Just chicken nuggets all day.
Yeah, exactly.
Dr. Torres, where can everyone find you, man?
Well, you can always find me at drjacobtorres.com. That's where I have my own website. So I just kind of have my papers and my videos there that I've been in. And yeah, you can always email me off of that if you want to find me for whatever reason. And
I'll link out to Santa Barbara Nutrients as well down below, too.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Right. Cool. Right on, my man. Thanks,
nice talking to you.